We're going out of order in terms of the numbers on the chapters in our textbook. And the reason for that is that other faculty that teach here use different textbooks that are in different orders. Now, sometimes I'm the one that compromises, like I am this semester, and I go out of order, and at other times the other faculty compromise and they go out of order. So it's our turn to go a little out of order. So we're going to start chapter 18 now. Let's take a look at it. So the heart, both its anatomy and its physiology, happened to be my second favorite organ in the whole body. The eyeball is up there really close, but the heart is fascinating. And so what we are going to do is start, as usual, taking a look at the anatomy of the heart, and that's part 1 in your note outline and in this series of tutorials. Next, we are going to start with looking at how cardiac muscle fibers and skeletal muscle fibers differ. You may have to look back at your A&PII 1 notes to remind yourself of the structure of skeletal muscle fibers. The third unit really, or the third part, really looks hard at cardiophysiology. It is absolutely stunning and amazing that our heart beats on average about once a minute for every hour of your day, for every day of your life. And it just keeps on ticking as long as it's healthy. And even when it becomes unhealthy, oftentimes it can adapt and continue to function just fine. Let's take a look. The whole purpose of the heart is to pump, to create enough pressure by contracting the muscles that form the chambers, that pressure ends up pushing blood through the different circuits. Now we will take a look at the circuits through which blood flows as well as blood itself. But in the meantime, you should realize that the systemic circuit starts here with the left ventricle, pumping blood out through the aorta and all of its branches. Eventually, they will branch into billions of capillary beds, and this is where the body tissues receive their oxygen, their nutrients, and they will get rid of carbon dioxide and waste products. At that point in time, that capillary is going to drain into vein, eventually into the vena cava, which return the blood to the right atrium. And so the systemic circuit runs from the left ventricle to the tissues to the right atrium. The pulmonary circuit starts here in the right ventricle. It pumps deoxygenated blood up through the pulmonary artery to the capillaries that surround the air pockets called alveoli in the lungs, and that's where it unloads CO2 and picks up oxygen. That blood drains into pulmonary veins, which returns to the left atrium. So the pulmonary circuit runs from the right ventricle and back to the left atrium. Now, I want to make a point here that you need to understand. Any vessel that goes towards the heart is going to be a vein. Any vessel that goes away from the heart, that leaves the heart, that is going to be an artery. And this is why we need to ignore whether there's oxygenated or deoxygenated blood in these blood vessels. Again, you'll see leaving the left ventricle, we have oxygenated blood going through the aorta, which is the major artery, and deoxygenated blood returning to the right atrium through vena cava, which are major veins. But in the pulmonary circuit, it starts here in the right ventricle, and that takes blood through pulmonary arteries. It is deoxygenated, but this is an artery because it's leaving the heart. And when this blood picks up oxygen, the oxygenated blood returns to the heart through pulmonary veins. Why is it a vein? Because it's going back to the heart. The location of the heart is key. It is very well protected by the rib cage and the sternum. Most of the heart sits just posterior to the sternum. It also is anterior to the spinal column, so it is in a pretty protective place. When we take a look at a cross section, a transverse section of the thorax, we can see how the sternum is here, spinal column is there. On either side we have the lungs. Here's the left one, here's the right one. So we must be looking from an inferior view. And then here, protected in the middle in what is referred to as the mediastinum, is the heart. Again, this illustration shows that. We're going to look at this picture in two different ways. The first one we are going to look at is just taking a look at the three layers of the heart wall. As you can see here, the layer that lines the inside of the chamber of the heart is the endocardium. The thickest part, made up of cardiac muscle cells, is myocardium. And then on the outside of that is the epicardium. You should be familiar with these root words because you saw them before with both muscle and nerve. Epi on the outside, myo is muscle, endo is on the inside. The second way we're going to take a look at this illustration is in terms of the entire serous membrane. Now, you came across serous membranes in A&PII, and the pericardium is just one of the three that you studied. The pericardium has several extra layers. First, on the outermost is the fibrous pericardium. Many of those fibers are what stabilize the heart to the surrounding tissue, and here we see it connecting to the pulmonary trunk. Deep to that is the parietal layer of the serous pericardium. Deep to the parietal layer is the pericardial cavity. What is inside that cavity? Serous fluid. If this is not familiar, you need to go back and take a look at the serous membranes. And as we learned in A&PII, we have a parietal layer and a visceral layer. Well, if we go deep to the cavity, we say, oh, I thought it was called the epicardium, but in fact, it is the same thing as the visceral layer of the serous pericardium. Now, before we get into the various chambers of the heart, the more detailed look at the heart anatomy, I want to point out the interesting thing about the way the cardiac muscle fibers are aligned. They come around the atria. Those are the top two chambers. And then they take a turn and end up forming the myocardium of the two ventricles. We are going to take a look at this. I have a funny little way of looking at it in class to take a look at the significance of it. It is, like I said before, really cool. Looking at a frontal section of the heart, we are still looking at the heart as though it's the patient's heart from the anterior view, but we're looking at a section. We can see the internal structures, the internal chambers of the heart. And here we see the right atrium, the left atrium. Below we have the right ventricle, and on the left ventricle. So what is the division between the atria called? What do you think would separate the two atria? It's not on this picture. So how would we figure out what it's called? Perhaps we can take a look at the division between the ventricles. So if we look, this big layer of muscle here is called the interventricular septum. What would we call the dividing line between the two atria? If your guess was interatrial septum, you are correct. Now, which of the two chambers are divided by the atrioventricular valve? Well, think about the words. Atrioventricular. This is kind of a duh question, right? What separates the atria from the ventricle? Atrioventricular valve. Here is an external view from the anterior position, taking a look at the heart as though we were looking at it in somebody's chest from the front. You can see the atria, right and left. Remember, we are looking at the patient's heart. And then the ventricle, the right ventricle and the left ventricle. Those are the four major chambers. We'll look at details of these as we look at more pictures. But what you should notice is from the inside, you should be able to see the grooves or sulci that exist that visually and anatomically separate some of the chambers. So what is the name of the boundary between the atria and the ventricles? What is the name of the boundary between the two ventricles on the anterior wall? And what marks the boundary between the ventricles on the posterior of the wall? We'll see it more clearly in the picture from the posterior view. This picture is deja vu all over again. We're actually going to see it a couple more times after this. Again, looking at the frontal section of the heart, we can take a look more closely at the structure and function of the atria. Now, one of the things I want to point out is the atria have a flap-like structure that covers it, both right and left, and that flap is called an auricle. Do you remember this root word, auri? That means ear. And I think it was called the auricle because it looks like a big elephant's ear. You can see it on the previous illustration. Taking a closer look at the atria, both the right and the left atrium, the whole function of the atria is to allow for blood to return to the heart through veins, and from there be first allowed to just flow into the ventricles, and then when the atria contract, to actually push more blood into the ventricles. The walls of the atria are quite thin, which means that although they have cardiac muscle with which to contract, they don't contract with much force. They don't need to. So a couple of other internal structures to take a look at. One is the fossa ovalis. When a fetus is developing, they don't have a way to ventilate the lungs, and therefore they don't get oxygen from the lungs the way an individual does once they're born. Instead, there has to be a different way to bring oxygenated blood from the mother to the fetus and a way for it to circulate. We'll look at that circulatory pattern in more detail when we look at blood vessels. But the fossa ovalis here has closed up, and that's the normal thing, that once a baby is born, within a very short amount of time, that what started out as a hole gets closed up. If a baby is born with a hole in their heart, that is what's meant by it. So fossa ovalis in the individual after they've been born, and foramen ovale in the developing fetus. Let's take a look at the ventricles next. Some interesting things. Again, these are connective tissue valves, and the valves are kept open during the passive time of the heart by chordae tendineae. Chordae tendineae. They're almost kite-like strings that hold the valve open, and they attach to these interesting projections up on the inside of the chamber wall, papillary muscles. So the chordae tendineae connect to the papillary muscles. Now, the ventricles look at the width of the myocardium here. Even in the right ventricle, that wall is much thicker than we saw here in the atria. And the reason for that is the ventricles are responsible for contracting with enough force to move the blood through the blood vessel circuits that we talked about at the beginning of the chapter. And the final note here before we move on, what is the difference in the thickness between the two ventricular walls? look at how thick the left ventricle wall is compared to the right. Why is there a difference? The left ventricle has to contract with enough force to overcome a lot of blood pressure in the aorta. Okay? If we were to look at this blood pressure further down, say in the arm, it would record 120/80. Coming right up out of the heart, it's higher than that. It's probably 135/100. Where the right ventricle still has to overcome some pressure to push blood up into the pulmonary trunk, but not as much. We're probably looking at having to overcome a pressure of 35/8. So that's a much lower pressure circuit. So if you have to push harder, what do you need? Bigger muscles.